Welcome, welcome to this evening's presentation on carbon taxes in Canada. Uh, many Canadian, many Canadians feel they are paying too much in carbon tax, but aren't sure why these taxes exist or where the money goes. So Trevor is here to explain all that to us. Um, Trevor is a professor at the University of Calgary's Department of Economics and the Director of Fiscal and Economic Policy at the School of Public Policy. What was? Trevor got his university degree, PhD from University of Toronto, and an undergraduate degree in finance from Simon Fraser University. Trevor has got a lot to say, so I won't take too much time. And
thank you very much. Just get this back on. All right. Well, it's a real pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me. And to talk about a topic like carbon taxes is always fun. People do have some strong views about it. And hopefully at the end of tonight, I'll leave you with maybe some different perspectives about carbon taxation in general, because in Canada, many don't realize we have multiple carbon tax systems, some of which are controversial, some of which are not. And we can kind of clarify where they apply, what we do with the revenues, and all of that. But I think I'll start just by noting that if you have questions as we go, feel free to interrupt. It's not that big of a space, so that can be pretty manageable, but I'll try and certainly leave time for questions and conversations at the end. Now, I guess I'll just begin with, of course, what we're trying to do with carbon taxes. Like with any climate policy, we're trying to lower greenhouse gas emissions. Okay? And historically, we've been gradually lowering them. So the red line here, this is Canada's actual level of greenhouse gas emissions. If we go back 20 years, it was about 750 million tons of greenhouse gas emissions per year. And that's down now to about 680 or so million tons. Now you can see there's a lot of variation there in that red line. Okay? That's not because of policy being very stringent in those years or, in 2020, other things to the economy that lead the overall level of industrial activity to change, or in COVID, the amount of driving that people were doing, especially in those early months falling. So there's a lot of variation that's just due to economic conditions. And that's important because, and I'll come back to this later on, carbon taxes do have broader implications for the economy, for productivity and growth. And so we need to think about them together. Also notice projections going forward. And these, they're model-based projections. And for folks here in the room, that's not itself going to be a scary concept. How else are we going to do it? We try and model out all the interactions between sectors, different technologies, and what they mean for emissions. Yeah. So this, I think, is just connected for the folks online. Yeah. I'll just project a little better. And notice that the projections going forward, there's a pretty wide band there. If we look out to 2035 and ask, what do we think Canada's emissions are going to be? We have this range of about 100 million tons that year, depending on what's the rate of population growth, what's the rate of economic growth. Oil prices are very important for what Canada's emissions are. So there's a lot of uncertainty around where we're going. And just keep that in mind, because there's also a lot of uncertainty around the effects of different policies, carbon taxes in particular. Okay. So one way to get around some of that variation is not to think about emissions, but to think about emissions per dollar that we generate in economic activity. There's much less variation in that, much more stability. It's really the economy that's driving the ups and downs year to year. But notice now you can see this very clear and gradual improvement that has been occurring over the past 2+ decades already. The federal carbon tax came in here in 2019. Alberta introduced one in 2017. Okay? And there has been a lot of improvement since. So carbon taxes are not, nor is any particular policy a necessary component of improving emissions going forward. It's just one tool out of many possible tools. And all policies are going to come with pros and cons and trade-offs. And I'll try and highlight what some of those are and why carbon taxes are on the table in many countries. Now, looking ahead, these are again model-based estimates, and I'll come back to what we think carbon taxes are specifically delivering in terms of emissions reductions in the future. Most of the improvement that we're going to see in Canada, like most of the improvement we have already seen, largely comes from, well, technological innovation on the transportation side, improving fuel efficiency, changes in how we generate electricity, so phasing out coal in Ontario and now in Alberta, that's delivered quite a bit. And so it's that kind of gradual but continuous improvement that's always there in the background, and then policies there to try and speed things up a little bit. Now, to give you a sense of where our emissions are coming from, I think this is a nice way to look at it. So that's Canada's total emission. And each of the colored components here is a different source. The largest now is oil and gas. That's right here at a little over 200 million tons. Okay, so 200 million out of the total amount, large share by far. Next up, transportation. Okay, our driving, trucking activity, rail, airlines, all of that included. Those two combined, basically half. So half of emissions just from two things, oil and gas, transport. Then you have electricity in this pink shaded region. Look at how much smaller it is today relative to where it was. That's the coal phase out, basically, the whole ball game there. And that's going to shrink even more because Alberta's not yet in that data point there, the full phase out in Alberta. Heavy industries next, and then buildings. So carbon taxes can't apply to everything. Think about a landfill and the methane emissions that sometimes occur there. We're not levying a carbon tax on those. So some emissions are not priceable in the normal sense, but emissions from heavy industry, from oil and gas, certainly transportation, buildings and the fuel we use for heating, those are priceable. So about 3/4 to 80%, depending on the province, of emissions are priceable, and some are not. So there's always going to be scope for thinking about different policies for landfills or for methane leaks in pipes. You know, regulatory approaches are usually what we do there. We also have in Alberta a provincial carbon tax that applies on our oil and gas and our heavy industry, not the federal one. So that right there is interesting, I think. We have carbon taxes levied provincially, and it alone right there, pretty uncontroversial. And it's the largest source of emissions already. And if we break out to the large provinces, notice big differences. Alberta up here in the top left, much more emissions than BC or Quebec. Okay. Industrial structure is different. Hydroelectricity is a zero emitting source of electricity generation there. But notice in Alberta, oil and gas alone, just a little more than half of total emissions. But we levy a carbon tax on that in Alberta, and that's not a controversial carbon tax. And I just want to keep re-emphasizing this point because people talk, especially in the public conversation around carbon taxes, is usually framed as a liberal versus conservative, left versus right. And there's certainly healthy debate around the fuel charge that we see at the pump or on our home. There's not a lot of controversy between any of the parties around heavy industry and having a price levied there. Okay. All right. There we go. So now that we've kind of set the stage for what the emissions are, let's kind of think about where Canada sits around the world in terms of carbon price. We're not the only country that levies. In fact, lots of countries levy them in one form or another. Okay, so different colors mean different things. It doesn't really matter what they each are, but if you're a jurisdiction with any color that's dark, you have a carbon price levied, either an explicit tax or a cap and trade system. I'll talk about those two different ways of pricing emissions in a moment. But all of Canada, if we look south of the border, so our largest trading partner, California, Washington, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, New York, have carbon prices in place. In fact, California and Quebec are in the same system, a cap and trade system. And other jurisdictions, Colorado, Oregon, are currently in the design implementation stage. There's no federal policy in the United States, but there are some state level policies. But in Europe, it's all covered within a European trading system. That's a cap and trade system. There's pricing in Australia, in China, and then there's currently systems being developed elsewhere, including India. Okay, so carbon taxes, carbon pricing more generally is increasingly common. It covers now about 25% of global emissions are covered now by a carbon tax or carbon price of one form or another. Okay. See a hand, sir? What's the ETS? Oh, the European trading system or the emissions trading system more generally. So cap and trade. And I'll talk about that in a bit. But basically, it's where we don't set a tax in that jurisdiction. We issue permits, and those are auctioned, and that price can vary depending on the auction. Okay. So 25% of global emissions are covered by a carbon price of some form or another. The overwhelming majority of that is cap and trade. That's blue. It's the red that's a carbon tax. Okay, so they used to be a little more comparable, but in the last couple of years, cap and trade systems have really dominated. Now, just having a carbon price is one thing, but if I'm charging you, like in Canada, we have $80 per ton as the current price that is set. If I have a carbon tax and set it at $1 a ton, then these are two very different systems, okay, even though they exist. And most of the pricing systems that we have are fairly low price. So here what we're looking at is every jurisdiction's carbon price, every jurisdiction that has a carbon price and what that price is. Canada is right here. So we do have among the highest carbon price in the world, certainly not the highest, that's Uruguay that has the highest. So we're at about 60 US dollars. Okay, so 80 Canadian, 60 US dollars. That's just a little bit shy of the price range that we think, based on modeling exercises, what we might need globally to be consistent with a 2% temperature target, which is anywhere between $65 to $125 per ton US by 2030. So we are increasing our carbon price in Canada, and so we are going to soon start to get into that range. But if you want to have a sense, why did the government pick $170 per ton by 2030? Well, that's about 120 US dollars per ton. That puts us up at the high end of that 2% global temperature goal. Again, it's a model-based estimate, doing the best we can. It might be too high, it might be too low, even in the context of future models that refine those estimates. But that's kind of where the number came from. It's a number that's probably in line with that 2% goal. Now, publicly, Canada is committed to this 1.5% goal, which would require a price of around $230 to $380 per ton by 2030. Again, US dollars, that's something like 450 Canadian by 2030. A lot of these other jurisdictions just have very modest carbon prices, and we'll see what happens there. Canada, it's currently high, and it's growing by meaningful amounts each year. How much revenue does this raise? Well, globally, carbon prices, cap and trade, or carbon taxes raise about 100 billion US dollars in total revenue. Okay, so there is a lot of revenue out there. So thinking about the Canadian experience hopefully gives you some insight into, I guess, this policy more generally, because it does create a considerable amount of public funds. All right, so that was all kind of motivation behind maybe why the topic is interesting, but I'm gonna take a step back and think like an economist for a bit. Why carbon pricing at all? Like, why carbon taxes? From at least my perspective, and that's to recognize that there's a lot of different ways to lower emissions. But these different ways cost different amounts. Okay, so depending on how you lower emissions, you're going to be incurring an economic cost that is higher than if you maybe lower emissions another way. There's various kind of ways of thinking about that. And these estimates, again, vary. If we think about energy efficiency programs, sometimes have negative costs. Now, why is that? And I think just behaviorally, a lot of us, myself included, we don't operating our home. Or like I had incandescent bulbs for the longest time, even when LEDs were cheaper, and it would pay for itself for me to just unscrew an incandescent bulb that has not yet burnt out, but replace it with an LED. Like the electricity savings alone, when LEDs dropped to like $1 a bulb, I still didn't do it. And a lot of us are like that. We need little nudges or things to make us do things. Advertising campaigns or little promotional incentives can nudge people to do things that are basically, paying had they done it themselves, or just for whatever reason don't do it. So there's lots of low-hanging fruit there. But then there's other ways that are more expensive. Subsidizing ethanol. And the US does a lot of this. We do some of it as well. That lowers emissions at the cost of about $180 a ton. Of course, it depends on the program and the context, so I'm just taking one estimate. EV subsidies in Quebec, $400 a ton. Right? So yeah, you're going to lower emissions, but you're going to do it at that price. Blocking pipelines, I like to put up there, because pipelines are also one of these controversial policies out there, and many oppose them on grounds that it'll help lower emissions. And indeed, yeah, if you block pipelines, that lowers the producer price of oil received in Alberta, probably leading to less investment in future production. And there might be emissions that at an enormous cost of roughly $2,000 per ton. So this is just a section. Think about the millions of decisions that every individual and every business is making on a day-to-day, month-to-month, year-to-year basis. And every one of those decisions can affect emissions at some cost. How's a government going to know what activity or decision to incentivize or to discourage? Because it can't know everything about every situation. That knowledge is decentralized in the minds of all of us as individuals and as business operators. And so a government needs to think about that. And let me just illustrate, and I guess for this crowd, this is maybe too simple, but imagine there's 10 options to lower abatements, and I stack them in terms of what their costs are, and say I want to lower emissions by 5. Well, I'll just then obviously take the 5 cheapest options to lower emissions and not do the remaining 5. But if you, as a government, you can't really know what the costs are because you're not in the business, on the floor, in everyone's homes, and you start mandating what kind of appliance to purchase or what kind of equipment. You might pick these 5, thinking, all right, those will be the 5 I'll pick. But you've now picked a couple of these higher cost options and left some lower cost abatement options on the table. And so you've lowered emissions by the same amount over here, but at a higher total cost. So that's what we want to avoid in general. We want to lower emissions in the cheapest possible way. And so if you do that you can do that in 2 ways. Well, you can, on the left, cap and trade system, fix the amount of emissions in total that we're going to allow by issuing permits. And then companies will trade those permits between themselves. Okay? The ones who have high cost of abatement, they will look and they'll say, well, I want to buy a permit. Anyone want to sell me a permit? And these people with low cost options will say, well, I don't need a permit. I can not emit very cheaply. So why don't I sell you a permit at a cost less than your abatement cost, but higher than mine? Everybody wins. So you have all these permits out there, you auction them off, and that'll naturally lead, if the auction's well functioning and competitive, for all these low cost businesses out there to sell their permits, and for these higher cost ones to buy them. So that's cap and trade. Or you could just say carbon tax. Set a certain price, and if you set that price in line with the abatement cost of the last activity that you need to achieve your goal, then naturally all these activities will just cease. They'll say, well, I can turn off this machine or change my light bulbs at a lower cost than paying the tax, so I'll do that. Whereas these firms, they'll say, I'd rather pay the tax than actually incur the cost of lowering the emissions. So you put a price that's going to naturally incentivize the low cost abatement options to be undertaken. Okay? Or at least that's the goal. That's the idea behind carbon pricing. Okay? It's governments don't know what to do in the millions of decisions that everybody is taking. So it's going to decentralize those decisions by giving a uniform incentive for actors to incorporate into their decision making. I guess as an aside, notice these folks are not going to be happy. Now they're paying a tax and they're not changing their behavior. They'll be out there saying, what's the point? I'm not changing my behavior. The point is not to change everyone's behavior. The point is only to change behavior of those who have cheap ways of lowering emissions. And that might be a minority of individuals. Now in Canada, we have both. We have carbon tax and we have one jurisdiction with a cap and trade system. Now this right here is a little bit of a problem because the two policies are not aligned. We have $80 per ton that prevails everywhere and a little over 50 in the last auction in Quebec. It's a problem because having uniformity in the incentive is the way you get the cheap. It's like there's folks who could lower emissions in Quebec by a ton and it costs only 60. And yet we're incurring 80 elsewhere to lower by that same ton. So that's problematic and something we would need to think about in the future. This choice of why tax versus cap and trade, I think that's important to consider, like the pros and cons of each. So both generate revenue. And I'll get to the revenue in the very next slide, if that's what you're waiting for. Because the auctions in the cap and trade system, the government's creating these, and then it's supplying the markets, and then people bid on them, and then they're paying the government. Right? They're bidding on the permits that the government creates, that generates revenue. Or carbon tax revenue is just you're literally paying the tax, and that's generating the revenue. Price certainty, though, you know what it costs to emit a ton if you're in a carbon tax jurisdiction, $80. In a cap and trade system, you have certainty over the price because it's going to vary from one auction to the next. Maybe there's a high demand for permits, one auction, so the price goes up, and then there's low demand at another auction, so the price goes down. Does this day to day. So if you Google it, you can see it fluctuating a lot. It's usually tied to economic conditions. So when demand is strong, when economic growth is strong, that leads the price to rise. But if you're an investor thinking about making long-term decisions, that price certainty feature of a carbon tax is a potential benefit. But emission certainty, you do not have carbon tax. You set the price and then leave everyone to make their own decisions. And maybe emissions don't fall much at all. In a cap and trade system, though, you're picking how many emissions you're going to allow. And then it's the price that varies. So if you're, in general, like private sector industry making long-term, large-scale investments, price certainty matters. But if you're the government and you're concerned about emissions levels because you have a target to reach, the emission certainty matters too. So there is a tension between these two policies. Okay. This next one here, this one's really interesting, undermining other initiatives. There's lots of policies that governments roll out to lower emissions. Think about the zero emissions vehicle subsidy program again. If you have a carbon tax in place and then you do something else on top of it, then you're going to lower emissions by more. If you have a cap and trade, you're not. Like the Quebec zero emitting vehicle program, if it lowers emissions in one part, that'll lower demand for permits in the auction, lowering the price, leading emissions to be higher elsewhere than would have otherwise have been the case. So in a cap and trade system, basically anything else you do within the coverage of the system doesn't have any effect at all on emissions. It only affects that clearing price within the auction. Okay. All right, other things, blah, 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 political considerations. This one, of course, matters a lot and will matter quite a bit next year, I anticipate, in a federal election campaign. Carbon taxes are visible. You see them. And you see them on frequent purchases. You see them on monthly utility bills. You see them at the gas pump regularly. And taxes that are visible and that you frequently encounter day to day are not popular. The GST is not popular for that reason. The previous sales tax, so if you think back to what we had prior to the GST, right, the federal sales tax, or some refer to it as the manufacturer sales tax, most people didn't know it was there. It was not unpopular because you couldn't see it. GST, much better tax for lots of reasons, but it's visible, so not popular. Carbon taxes, not popular because they're visible. Cap and trade, there's interesting polling in Quebec where a majority of Quebecers don't think they have a provincial carbon price at all. Because it's embedded in the supply chain, it's way upstream. Consumers don't realize that they're paying it, even though it's there, including on gasoline. It's just hidden. Okay? So that's a feature or a bug, depending on what you think about it. I like visible costs. Makes us make good decisions, but obviously challenging for politicians. All right, now let's think about the money. The financial implications, both for individuals, but also the economy generally. And this is a big concern for a trade-intensive economy like Canada. And it turns out that these two questions are very hard to separate from each other. So if you follow the debate in the public around carbon taxes, you may have come across folks referencing the Parliamentary Budget Office report on the implications of the carbon tax for individuals. And they look at the dollars that people pay in carbon taxes, and they think about the rebates that individuals receive, okay, so the financial side of things. They also think about the economic side of things, because economic growth is going to affect wages and salaries and other income that people receive, so that's relevant as well. Now, how might carbon taxes affect the economy? Well, one way they do it is through trade. A huge fraction of Canada's economy is tied to international trade, and a lot of what we emit in Canada, when we produce goods and services, is actually destined for a consumer abroad. So in orange here, we have about 300 million tons of emissions in Canada, about a third of the total, or a little more than a third, is embedded within goods that we export. And so if we ratchet up stringency of climate policy and carbon taxes in particular, then we're going to be raising production costs, which might affect the international competitiveness of those exporters. And to the extent that it does, it might represent a drag on economic growth. Okay, so that's one channel, but a very important channel for a country like Canada. So it's that international competitiveness dimension. And then on the flip side, which is kind of similar intuition, but I can't show it in a graph, is that we import stuff from abroad as well. And if the domestically supplied but emissions intensive item increases in price, we might switch to an imported item from abroad. So another potential source of carbon pricing leading to this competitiveness concern internationally. Perfectly valid concern, and why Europe right now is thinking about levying a carbon tax on certain types of imports to kind of shut off that channel. Okay. I'm not going to talk more about that. So how much might it slow economic growth? Well, estimates vary. And it's probably too soon to really know. Okay, we have model-based estimates. We know what our models of the Canadian economy, how they behave under different scenarios. And empirically, we might never really know anyway. Right? Empirical work is hard. So many things are taking place affecting emissions every day. And for a researcher looking back and trying to ask, how much did the carbon tax lead emissions to decline by? You'd have to identify the causal effect of that policy on emissions in a way that's separated from all other factors that are also affecting emissions. So researchers will definitely try. Many have tried to look at British Columbia's experience and elsewhere, but really hard. So how much has the carbon tax lowered emissions by? I don't know. And we might never know. How much do we think they're going to lower them by? 13 million tons by 2030. This is relatively small in terms of like the overall amount of emissions in Canada. Now, these I'd say are 13 million cheaply avoided emissions, certainly relative to many other policies. And how much will it shrink the economy by? Well, again, we'll never know. What do our models think it'll shrink the economy by? About 0.6% by 2030. So think about this path of carbon taxes ramping up. That'll shave about 0.1% off of GDP growth now in 2030. So that's about 0.1% slower growth of wages, salaries, and incomes in general. And well, given the time, maybe I'll jump now to households. How does that affect households? Well, lower GDP, and this varies by province. So this is straight out of the PBO report, and I have no issue with the underlying method that they use. That shrinks labor and capital income. Okay, slower economic growth leads to lower growth in income, lower returns to business owners. That has implications for wages and salaries as well. And they estimate it'll shrink income roughly by 2%, 1 to 2%, depending on the jurisdiction, by 2030. So that's one cost. And this is a cost that generates no revenues at all. Okay, so levying a carbon tax generates revenues, and then you can do something with those revenues. Slowing economic growth, that's a cost, but there's no revenues anywhere, so it's just a pure cost. Now, what about those revenues? Well, here's the federal budget. Lots of sources of revenues on the left, mainly from taxes, or this one right here. So this is on the year just ended, about $8 billion, a lot of dollars, but out of the $450 billion raised by the federal government, so it's a relatively small component. Where do those revenues go? Well, they go over here, rebates. Lots of other sources of federal spending, and the federal government largely just takes in dollars and transfers those dollars to others. Carbon taxes are no different. Every dollar it raises in carbon taxes goes back somewhere to someone, with one caveat I'll come back to in a second. If you can see that, that's a 7. That's lower than the 8. 90% goes straight back to households. So if you file your taxes, you will get those direct deposits. And that's just automatic. Not everyone files their taxes, so they're missing out. But if you file, you get it. The remaining 10%, that's only something that the government has just this year made a decision about. So they've been accumulating all of these funds, and now they've rolled out some programs for small businesses, for certain communities and municipalities, and other targeted groups. So 90% is automatic, and then 10 is kind of doled out in this discretionary way. But it's kind of budget neutral in the sense that every dollar in goes out somewhere, back to individuals or to businesses or communities. This is also segmented by province. So we know all the carbon tax revenues that are coming from fuel purchases in Alberta. Very easy to track. All that then goes out, 90% of it, to their direct deposits. Okay. Track all the revenues raised from New Brunswick and send 90% of that all back to residents in New Brunswick. Okay, so it's dollars in, dollars out, province by province. So there's no budgetary implications of this for the federal government overall, with one small exception, and that's the GST. When you pay the GST on fuel, or anything really, you're paying the GST also on the excise taxes levied on a product. So if you buy cigarettes, right, price of the cigarette, then the excise tax, then the GST on the like 5% of the whole value, including the taxes. Okay? When you buy liquor, you're paying GST on the provincial markup, like the alcohol tax. And you're paying GST on the levying 5% on the carbon tax, and that doesn't get rebated to anybody. So that's the portion that just flows into the government's general budget, and it just funds whatever the government's doing. Okay. So if we think 2030, we ramp up this carbon tax all the way to 170, what might the federal government well, think about the two things so we have the GST revenue, but we also have slower rates of economic growth. That'll affect income taxes. Okay, what is all, and we rebate all of what's, or 90% of what's raised. The PBO estimates that by 2030, the federal government at $170 a ton will have about $25 billion in carbon tax revenue. Might be higher, might be lower. It depends on what our emissions are in 2030, but that's our best guess. 25 billion 2030. Plus GST of about 1 billion. Per take. The slower economy, that's going to shave about 5 billion off of government revenue because of the smaller income tax base. And then the rebates that are sent out, that takes us down to an overall budget effect of about negative 4 billion. Which means because of the slower economic growth, the 2030 effect of a $170 per ton carbon tax on the federal deficit is to make it 4 billion larger. Okay. Now, that's not meaning small in the perspective of the overall government budget, and it's driven entirely from that slower rate of economic growth. Now, what about households, right? On a day-to-day level, what does it mean for them? Well, it depends on where you live. Carbon taxes are going to affect people differently in different locations. So let's think about a couple of ways that it affects people differently. A big one is home heating. There's basically 3 buckets: gasoline, home heating, and everything else. And those buckets are in aggregate roughly the same size financially, most people. But depending on where you live, home heating might be more or less affected. So let's look at Quebec. They're a good one. Here, or I guess the graph as a whole, we're looking at how much energy you use, or your home, mainly heating. In Quebec, in blue, that's electricity. Most of their heat is electricity generated, and most of their electricity is hydro produced. Okay. Natural gas is not completely absent, but natural gas is in red in Quebec. Not a very big amount. Home heating oil in whatever, teal, also pretty small. So in Quebec, the carbon tax, or in their case, cap and trade, the implication of that for home heating, really small. Most people completely unaffected. But notice in Ontario, and in particular in the prairie provinces, it's natural gas that dominates. Okay. Manitoba is also big on hydro, also big on electricity heat. Look at Alberta. Natural gas hitting, home heating here, that's subject to the carbon tax. If we go to Atlantic Canada, and this is just a new development, but last year, what did we do to home heating? And we exempted it from the carbon tax. Okay. Now, there's a tiny bit of teal if you squint, like in other places. But that was a policy aimed at Atlantic Canada for obvious electoral reasons. So now there, you don't have carbon tax home heating to a meaningful degree. You have, if you squint, a natural gas use, but it's basically electricity or home heating. Electricity, not really affected to a large extent. Home heating now, exempt. So the carbon tax implications for individuals in terms of home heating, it's basically just the 5 Western provinces now. Okay. And to a meaningful scale, because if we exclude Manitoba, it's Ontario, it's Alberta and Saskatchewan, and maybe BC. Okay, so that's where it's hitting. Now, what about gasoline? Wait, what? Yeah. So in terms of dollars, what this means is, no, I only have a few minutes left. So let me skip ahead. In terms of dollars, think about now the exercise asking, oh, how much do people drive? How much fuel do they use? And then we can estimate also implications of, well, how much carbon taxes are embedded in the food that you buy, or the other items that are shipped by truck from point A to point B. We can estimate. And so numbers vary. And so these are numbers that myself and Jen Winter, a colleague at the University of Calgary, are going to release in a brand new paper tomorrow. So preview for you guys. It adds up to, depending on what your income level is, different amounts, because people have different incomes, have different lifestyles, different size homes, different number of vehicles, or none at all. And so it adds up to roughly 1 to 2% of your consumption. Okay, $80 a ton before the rebate. So the carbon tax now is basically increasing consumption expenditures by 1 to 2%. That's the scale. Or in terms of income, it's about 3% of income. 1% of income for higher income. So if you wanted like a sense of scale, what's a sense of scale of $80 a ton? Well, it's kind of like an income tax of 1 to 3%, depending on where you are in the income distribution. Okay? So I find that an intuitive just way to appreciate the magnitudes. 1 to 3% income tax. Now, it's different for different types of households, and matters the most, it turns out, is whether you have kids or not. People who have kids of identical level of income compared to someone who doesn't have kids. Okay, the family with kids uses a lot more energy. I guess they're driving them around to activities. I don't have kids, so I can only assume they're driving them places, doing stuff with them. And they're just using more energy. They're also buying more food, for obvious reasons. And food is one of the indirect costs of carbon taxes. So it's a more energy sensitive, energy intensive item that we buy. And so you do this exercise for those as a share of income, for those with no children compared to those with children, it's about 1/4 to 0.5% lower in terms of that effective income tax rate. And so different people are affected in different ways. But we do have a rebate, right? We take these carbon tax revenues federally and then send them back quarterly to individuals. And these are just the raw costs. How much does the rebate offset the raw carbon tax cost? Well, it more than offsets it. And it does this for a couple of reasons. And these are the PBO estimates. In red, that's the rebate. So that's your average Alberta household next year, what it's anticipated to pay in carbon taxes. That's the rebate that it'll get. So the program overall is a negative cost, which means like, oh, their disposable income has gone up by the equivalent of about $500 a year. So your average household next year gets $500 more in the rebate than is paid in carbon taxes. Now that might seem weird. Well, when we talk about the average household, and you guys being engineers, the distribution of energy use is not symmetric. And so it's kind of skewed. And so the mean is higher than the median. So if you're kind of picking up what's even though I wrote average, sorry, you have that more than half of households are going to have carbon tax that are less, like more than half are going to be less than the average carbon tax. So you have a lot of high carbon tax paying households. You also have exports where we're raising revenue off of consumers where we can successfully pass through some of the cost on. And not all businesses can do that, but we're raising some revenue off of purchases of exported goods that have embedded carbon tax costs passed through. So that's kind of where the extra revenue comes from. But it slows the economy. Okay, and next year, the PBO estimates of the amount that it'll slow the economy by, that shrinks incomes below what it otherwise would have been. That'll lead next year the cost for your typical household to be about $250 a year, all in. Net cost of the carbon tax, the slower economy, including the rebate, $250 cost per year. Okay. By 2030, that changes to about $700, give or take, for your Alberta household. And that's mainly driven from the slower economy. All right, so I have gone on for about 45 minutes, and so I think I should not go through the detailed results here, but because this is kind of something that's very salient, food prices have risen by about 20% since this inflation spike started back in 2020. And a lot point to carbon taxes as a contributor. And food is an energy-intensive item, both to produce and to ship, okay? Largely on trucks. And go through the whole supply chain, asking, what are the emissions on the farm, the fuel use, how much is exempt, what's not, how much is incurred by the truckers, how much by the food manufacturers, how much by grocery stores, and look at the whole supply chain. And an $80 per ton carbon tax increases food prices, domestically produced food prices in Canada by about 0.8%. So certainly something you can measure, but it's not the most important reason why food prices have risen by 20%. But broader global factors of rising oil prices in 2022 in particular, fertile, those rather than carbon taxes. Yeah, too much on food. So because I wanted to end after 5 minutes, I think I'll maybe end it here and see if there's any questions or comments that people want to make, and we can explore that together. Yeah.
It's just be fact that wanting to pay more for food, groceries, and everything.
Yeah.
$800. But there was no reference in that number relative to the impact of carbon.
Right. So that number, so maybe I will linger on food prices. So what drives food prices at the grocery store are production costs with a 6-month lag. Okay, so the blue line there is our grocery price, and then the red line there is the farm input costs that we measure. What's behind the farm input costs? Well, lots of things lead to variation there. In blue, this is fertilizer. So the biggest reason why food prices have risen is fertilizer. Machinery fuel, that's in gray, that's another one. Okay? And so if you're projecting out for the next year, asking how much are food prices likely going to rise, you're effectively price is going to be what's fuel cost, what livestock prices are likely going to be. And carbon taxes affect food prices in a very, very narrow way. Most emissions on the farm are not subject to a carbon price. Natural gas used for drying activities, that is used at 4% of total costs. So it's nudging things at the margin. Where carbon taxes affect food prices in a big way is, I shouldn't have said big, but of the share of the effect, it's accounted for by transport manufacturers and fertilizer manufacturers. But we have these large emitter systems in Canada where we're not levying the carbon tax for them just straight up. We're levying the carbon tax on them relative to a standard that they're evaluated against. And we don't need to go into the complexity there, but we've designed the large emitter systems, which are largely provincial, not the federal system, insulates fertilizer manufacturers and product manufacturers to a great extent. About 80–90% of the carbon tax cost doesn't flow through their average costs and therefore to their prices. Policy insulates food prices from carbon taxes. And so the reason that food prices will rise next year, if these forecasts are correct, is not because of policy, but because of fertilizer costs and fuel costs rising for all sorts of other reasons, largely global factors. Yeah, but you're right, the report didn't break it down, carbon taxes versus not. Had it done so, carbon taxes would have been a tiny, tiny part of it, which is maybe why I didn't do it. Yeah.
What happens to be provincially imposed?
Great question. So most provinces have large emitter systems of their own, like Alberta. And if you think back to Alberta's emissions graph, the overwhelming majority of our emissions are covered by the provincial system. And it is not going away, and the government hasn't hinted that it wants to make it go away. The industry, oil and gas, wants it to stay. The question, though, is what's the price going to be? We're increasing the large emitter price in Alberta in lockstep with the federal price. So it's $80 that we charge our large emitters, and it's $80 that we face at the pump or on home heating. If the federal backstop goes away next year, then I suspect, but I suspect that Alberta wouldn't increase the large emitter price anymore. It would just leave it where it is. So if the election is early next year and things do change federally, then we'd probably stick with the $80 per ton. If the election's later next year, because April 1st is kind of the point where we increase the price, then we'd be at 95, and then we might stick at 95. So I think we just wouldn't continue with the price trajectory that is kind of baked in. But the large emitter system itself would just stay. Nothing would happen to it. Yeah.
Does the carbon pricing system achieve the policy objectives that we actually want to achieve?
Yeah.
For example, creating the electrical grid versus say just having an actual strategy to do it.
Yeah.
But really getting to a desired global outcome.
Yeah. So I guess that depends on what objective you're trying to achieve. So when I think about carbon taxes, which is a weird economist way of thinking about carbon taxes, it's not to lower emissions. I just want to make sure that the emissions that we're emitting are worth it. right? Climate change imposes costs on individuals and more or less depending on where you're living. And I'm not going to hang my hat on any number for damages are from a ton of emissions, but if let's say it's $100 per ton, if we were to monetize it. And the government of Canada, I should say, thinks it's right now about $250 a ton. Lots of debate about this. I don't know. If that $100 damage that we're doing somewhere in the world is generating benefits that are greater than $100, then that emission is worth doing. And so the carbon tax provides you with a signal as a decision maker that allows you to incorporate the full cost of your actions into your decision. And if nobody changes behavior, most people might then say, oh, the carbon tax was a failure. Whereas I would say, oh, no, I guess we just have a lot of very valuable emissions, and those are worth emitting. That's a weird way to look at it. If you want to achieve a particular emissions target, carbon taxes are not the way to go. You'd want to have much more command and control and centrally determined decision-making by government. Or you'd want to have a cap and trade where you fix emissions and you set it on a path that you, as a policymaker, choose to set it on. And that's fine, but it's going to come with a larger effect on GDP. So you got to balance these things. If the goal is just pure economic efficiency and abating only when it's cheap to do so, carbon taxes. If it's about lowering emissions, cost be damned, then it's other policies. So carbon taxes, our best estimates are that we're going to lower 13 million tons by 2030 at the cost of about 0.6% of GDP. Yeah, 13 million tons a year, yeah. At the cost, and GDP is an annual flow measure as well, so I think it's okay to compare them. 13 million tons a year by 2030, 0.6% off of the size of the economy by 2030. And whether that's achieving your objective or not, for me, yeah, the objective is the price, which is a weird way to think about it. But if your objective is to lower emissions by more than 13 million tons, then yeah, you'd want to think about other policies. Trying to do math in my head, which is not a good idea. We're about 2% of the total, and so if we're close to 100 times that by 50, you guys are engineers too. Help me out here. Yeah.
But equivalent to the emissions from the volcano that are up in Indonesia.
Yeah, and so this gets to a broader conversation about policy action in general. Because you're right, there's a lot of sources of emissions that we can't really do anything about. And so to what extent can we move the needle? And that's beyond my expertise to comment on, although we can clearly affect the emissions that we're responsible for. And that's largely what policymakers across the political spectrum are to do. It's just we're disagreeing at the moment tools that we're using to lower emissions. Yeah.
Trevor, excuse me.
Yeah.
There was a couple of slides near the beginning, and one showed a trend downwards. Red. There, that one there.
Yeah.
showed actually that we were reducing.
Yep.
Greenhouse gas. The next slide seemed to show that it was relatively flat at 600.
Yeah, so these different time scales. So this red here, that'll correspond to this. And I'm not projecting out beyond 2022 here.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Now, had I like changed, and I'm showing more years on this side. I should have thought of that visually, or right. Oh, this one? Yeah.
Comment that getting rid of coal-fired generating stations.
Yeah.
is the cause of
That's the
this.
exactly, yeah.
So, worldwide respect.
as something that's a substitute for anything that we do. That's kind of a whose emissions should we care about? And we should export LNG for all sorts of reasons, and that's one of them. So I don't know if that's an answer or not, but who gets credit for those emissions reductions? Well, we've already baked in as a world, not just like the Paris Agreement, but many agreements previous to it that, well, it's the other country that would get the credit for lowering emissions. And this is, I guess, another issue with choosing emissions quantity targets at the country level. What we care about are global emissions, not any given jurisdiction's emissions. But most jurisdictions choose targets that are based on their own emissions. And we don't have to. We could choose targets that are corresponding to prices and the estimated environmental damage of emissions and forget what the quantity of emissions actually are. But that's the weird economist way of thinking about it.
You made mention that Canada has the cap and trade
In Quebec, yeah.
nobody else does. You also seem to think that cap and trade is not a bad way of having some control. So
yeah,
what's the possibility of the rest of Canada going?
Terrible for Alberta because of oil and gas being such a big share of our emissions. Look at Quebec. Their emissions are from driving, from heavy industry, and then buildings and agriculture. And so pretty stable. So the auction price in a system where demand for emissions permits is pretty stable wouldn't be very unpredictable. Now, Alberta, our emissions, they go up and down a lot, especially in oil and gas, certainly by comparison to them, as a function of oil prices and activity in the oil sands. And so you'd have a carbon price that would have wild swings in Alberta, highly correlated to oil prices. So you'd be volatility to the economy of Alberta, much, much greater extent than you get in a more stable economy like Quebec. So yeah, we could set whatever amount we want, but we then would have our own little independent system. And then what the government of Canada would say is, well, your system's only allowed if it's consistent with some 2030 emissions reduction target of an X amount. So we just can't choose what the overall amount is. So Alberta, it might make sense to have cap and trade if it's integrated into a much broader market to dampen that volatility. And I don't mean Canada, I mean the United States. If there's a US-wide cap and trade, then that's a very interesting idea for Canada to consider joining and might be fine for Alberta. But for Alberta to have a provincial cap and trade system would be very volatile.
Is there a website officially from federal cap and trade?
So it's just Quebec that has cap and trade. Now, federal policies around when the federal carbon tax kicks in or not is in two situations. You don't have your own cap, or you don't have a cap and trade system with a sufficiently stringent path of emission. Most. I don't have a number off the top of my head, but these are, it's a great example of, in the green emissions here, things that are really hard or maybe not possible to price, right? It's the livestock related emissions from their digestion. I don't really know how it works, but we're not levying a price on that. So we're trying to think of other ways to lower emissions there. And that's where innovation, changing the feed, does this make sense? Are there additives to the feed that can be used? Those sorts of things that just become not a feasible option to install monitors on every. I mean, if you're levying a tax on something, you better measure it well, or you'd be forked and constantly. So we don't like prices there, and there's no prospect to. Hope the mic worked. Oh, good. Okay, good, good.
So,
Yeah.
It's somewhere like Quebec. You have no electricity.
No emissions from electricity. Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah, that's excluded from our broader conception of climate policy question. It's just excluded from what's the year-to-year emissions measurements that we're doing province by province. But that's a good point. Cement's a contributor, and that's like a technical challenge too in terms of how we lower emissions in that particular sector. No, so that would be thinking about where to estimate emissions on some kind of accrual basis where we're like gradually spreading the emissions out over time. Yeah, so that's an interesting thought.
Any other questions? Seeing none, I'm going to thank Trevor very much.
Great,
for
thank you.
an excellent talk, which really makes you think about carbon, and it's not as simple as we thought it was. So thank you very much, Trevor.
Thank you.
Megan Rose, Group of Chartered Engineers, have on your behalf made a donation to Operation Eyesight, and the person listed on the certificate inside now has sight because of your talk tonight. So, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And lastly, just before we cut, I'd like to remind everybody that CPGC is recognised as a relevant society by PEGA, and you can claim your 1 hour professional development hour for this talk. So thank you very much.